I was a fan, and the label was completely based on the idea that I loved these bands making this great music, and that no one else was going to record them. These bands were going to live short lives and burn out and disappear. And I guess my role as a fan was to take that fan thing a bit further and actually commit to starting a record label without really realising or understanding what was involved. So the naivety was quite a crucial part of it, which has its parallels with the book, really, where you sort of say, "I'm going to write this book," but you start writing, and a couple of thousand words in, you're veering off over here, where the story that you've kind of outlined in your notes is over here. So it takes on a life of its own, and that's been interesting, actually, re-exploring that sort of territory, those places, those times, that music. When I started thinking about writing the book, I had quite a firm idea that I'd write so many words per day, and I'd be very disciplined, and it would be the first draft would be finished on this date, and it would all move along very smoothly and nicely. And of course, the reality is quite different in that you spend a lot of time sort of staring out the window, thinking and abstractly about quite unrelated things, really. And occasionally you'll do your numbers that day. You'll write your 500 words and then not write anything for a week. And then write 3 or 4 thousand words in a day. But quite often I thought the best material was like that. It was spontaneous. And again, it was I'd be trying to work to a plan, but actually writing it took me somewhere quite different. And I think the highlights in the book are kind of those moments, really. Originally, I guess I did have the idea that we'd sort of, that I'd work through it all step by step, follow the plan, mention everybody properly. And it became quite apparent that it would be a book of lists, really. It would be just a book of, this happened on that day, and I love this band. And as a consequence, I've left quite a bit of information out. A lot of bands aren't talked about. Music, some key bands get talked about quite a bit, but a lot of bands that I really love just don't. So I regret that, but it's just how it happened, and I think it's the nature of memoir writing, really, that you go with it's about you for once. You're working on this thing, and it's probably going to be the only book you ever write, and you want to kind of try and get it right. You want to look great. You want your mother to be happy. You don't want to insult too many people. You want to mention everyone that you like, but say the right wrong things about the people you don't like. There's a lot to consider. People I worked with, they were kind of into progressive rock, and it was sort of earlier Genesis, Far Eastern Band, Patrick Moraz, who I believe was a keyboard player in Yes, all the good stuff, Gentle Giant, all the really good bands. So I was in this sort of soupy world of progressive rock, and there was kind of got a sense that there was something else coming. There was something else happening out there, and we couldn't quite work out what it was. There were a few imports, a few releases. Patti Smith, the Ramones. It was really hard to work out what you listen to a Ramones record for the first time in that environment. Very, very hard to know what it actually meant. And then, but the key thing was the Sex Pistols, and we kind of heard about them through the UK music press. But I think it was the Sex Pistols, Dylan Tate's piece on Radio with Pictures, and they were the Sex Pistols. For me, it just blew everything away, really. It just changed everything instantly. And that there was this, I guess now we see it as quite conventional sort of rock and roll, but with a very charismatic, snaring singer, frontman, Johnny Rotten, and just this attitude that was so, again, that whole progressive rock kind of namby-pamby sort of mainstream rock star thing that had gone before. And I was sort of hooked instantly, really. And from that point on, it was very hard to get the records to sort of to fuel the need. I think the first Wire album came out quite quickly. I mean, that's still a fantastic. Pink Flag is, you know, it's a remarkable record, and everything changed, and it became quite, aspects of it became quite commercialised quite quickly, in that there was sort of this new wave element where people were wearing coloured shirts, and well, everyone, if you had a mother or a sister or a girlfriend that was capable of taking your trousers in, then you'd do that. But there was this new wave thing, and then we kind of realised there was this other thing, this more arty side, which I guess we now know as sort of post-punk, which is what Johnny Rotten kind of did after, what John Lydon did after the Sex Pistols with Public Image. Wire, Buzzcocks, I'd say all of those were Pere Ubu, Devo even. It was obviously, a lot of it was just people picking up instruments and playing music for the first time. You know, any of us could do it, and it was like we could start our record collections, we could start our proper music lives from there. We could throw away all the crap records that we'd kind of accidentally accumulated beforehand from brothers or samples through the record shop or whatever. The stigma had gone. You could make do and make music, and there were people that were receptive and willing to accept it for what it was, how it was. There weren't all that many sort of punk bands in Christchurch. I mean, there was sort of the older guys that were kind of were given an impetus to kind of be active and do more stuff, and like Bill Doreen and Steve Kogel and Peter Stapleton, characters like Alan Meek, characters like that. The Voxels were an early kind of school age band, and they were kind of key. They were kind of like new kids doing their thing, and they kind of connected Tony Peake, and who was running the record shop out at the record department out at the University Bookshop. It was kind of a key character, and they were kind of a glue that kind of the scene developed around. And when I say a scene, there were probably about 20 people sort of interested. And they were playing places like Mollett Street, which was a non-licensed, just every second Sunday, I think, upstairs in a room on Colombo Street. And there were other bands like the Doomed, who were obviously just sort of there for on the back of, they weren't really plausible or believable. So we were reasonably discerning quite early. The Pin Group were kind of key, in that they were kind of a little bit later, but took it sort of seriously. We're our age group, and we're kind of trying to do this sort of a little bit influenced by what was happening in England, but trying to find a way of making something sort of new and unique. And I really felt that a lot of this music was going to be lost forever unless it was recorded. And a bit of an inspiration was Propeller Records in Auckland, and that they were quite active at the time and having a lot of success with the bands they were working with. And I kind of felt that we needed something like, well, not necessarily like Propeller and their commercial success, but we needed to be documenting what was happening, or it was going to be lost and gone forever, because Christchurch felt very insular. Like, I think the individual music scenes in New Zealand at that time, sure, bands were touring occasionally between the main centres, but quite isolated in themselves. So I I put my hand up really and just sort of said, I'm going to start a record label, and made the mistake of saying it, and then kind of felt obligated to follow through and actually do it. So the Pin Group were very much part of that beginning, and a band from Dunedin that I'd seen a few years earlier when I'd travelled down to Dunedin, called The Clean, came back through Christchurch. So the Pin Group were kind of key really, in that they're out of the same scene that had kind of developed in Christchurch. And Roy Montgomery had been to London and had got a bit of a feel for what was happening over there. And I liked them because they weren't just a pub band. They weren't just there to pull a crowd and play the hits, or they were writing their own songs and doing their own thing, and I enjoyed that immensely. And they had Ronnie Van Hout involved doing artwork for the posters, very distinctive posters. So fantastically coloured, hand-printed posters. So we did their first couple of singles, all their releases early on, and they were kind of key. You know, that was a really important step. I guess my first connection with music from Dunedin, or in Dunedin, was would have been 1978, and for some reason my friend Paul Smith and I decided to drive to Dunedin to see this band called The Enemy that we'd heard about. We drove down on my Morris 1100, which you don't really, for some reason, you don't really see them on the road anymore, but notoriously unreliable vehicles. And so we drove down. It was a bit further than we thought. It probably took about 5.5 hours. And we saw The Enemy play in this, as bands did back then, they played in halls because the pubs wouldn't have them. And so saw The Enemy. They were pretty much definitely the best band local band I'd seen to that date. You know, they were musically competent and not sort of fast. They were kind of a slow playing, grinding kind of band. And they had this, I guess, they had this showman sort of frontman, Chris Knox. And it was quite a spectacle. It wasn't a huge crowd. The Clean supported them. Clean, I think, on one of their first gigs, Doug Hood singing. I think they had 3 or 4 songs that they kind of repeated that were quite rough. They were still obviously learning to play. David's guitar playing was pretty basic. But yeah, they were kind of interesting. So yes, saw them and sort of went back, stayed at the Enemy flat afterwards. So I got to see Chris close up. Stayed the night. Drove back to Christchurch the next day. So that was my introduction to Dunedin and to a little bit of Dunedin music. And I guess there were quite a few people I get to know in that crowd and on that stage that night that I got to know quite well over sort of subsequent years. But The Enemy were definitely something special. I almost sort of wonder now whether they were sort of more of a sort of an anti-glam rock band rather than a punk band. But you know, there were songs they could play, they put on a show. It was quite a revelation, really. They were ramshackle the first time I saw them, but yeah, when they came back through Christchurch in '81, they were the full. You know, they were obviously a great band. I think I was on the stage before they'd even finished, kind of wanting to talk about whether they wanted to be a part of the Flying Nun thing. And they said, oh yeah, you know, they were sort of interested, we could talk about that. So I sort of thought about that for a couple of days and then thought, well, actually I might, anyone that sees them in Auckland's going to think the same that I did. I might just get on a plane and go to Auckland and harass them up there and see if they're still interested. So yeah, my fan thing, you know, the fan thing got me on the plane and flew to Auckland for the first time and, you know, marvelled at the Auckland heat and humidity and yeah, got to meet the band and they were still kind of interested. And I think at some stage we talked about Pat's recording at Night Shift Studios when they came back through Christchurch. And we didn't have any idea of, like, you know, budget for recording, so it was like this completely arbitrary figure of $50 was kind of pulled out of the air, and that was agreed. That was what was you know, offered to Varney at Night Shift, and it's kind of what we got, $50 worth of recording of Tally Ho. God, how much was it? $700, you know, a lot of money. Huge amount of money, but it's, you know, for me it just seemed like an obvious. We just had to make that regression and do it. And fantastic value for money. Recorded in a sort of an old, probably not much more than a shed. I think that's still there on Bond Street, next to the motorway bridge. And yeah, Boodle was. I mean, it's a great record, great EP. Kind of set the format for lots of records after. Sold a truckload. You know, well received. People loved it. And they were kind of, you know, sort of the most important band in New Zealand from that period on. Top 5 chart, I think, and we sold lots. And that was the start of Flying Nun, really. That gave us, from selling that EP, that was really like the confidence, gave me the confidence to do more. And I guess sort of, you know, when I talk about sort of an EP generating cash flow, you know, it's all relative. It did actually generate some enough cash to kind of look at doing other things, so other Dunedin bands and other bands around Christchurch, and it all just grew from that, really. So the Clean were kind of the connecting agents, I guess, for me to meet up with their friends, Chris Knox and Doug Hood. We lived in Auckland. Chris had come back from, well, they'd both come back from the Toy Love experience in Australia, kind of disillusioned with the mainstream music business. And Chris had started making music with Alec Bathgate's Tall Dwarfs. And I guess that they saw an enthusiastic music fan in me rather than a business person, along the lines of which they'd sort of had dealings with. And were kind of essentially keen to sort of link up with the Flying Nun thing that I'd kind of established the base for. And basically they suggested that they could do a better job of recording the Clean themselves on Chris's 4-track. And we went along with that, and we paid some money towards it and made that record, made the Boodle EP, which sort of, it was, I guess, the sales high watermark for the Clean. It was phenomenally successful, kind of inspirational for lots of other bands, kind of established the format, the EP format. We didn't really need to produce singles because you produce singles for radio play, and mainstream radio was never going to play what we were doing. And but at the same time, the bands weren't all that many bands quite ready to make albums, didn't have necessarily the material. And there was an audience that was kind of willing to pay money for an EP. Perhaps they wouldn't pay the money for a full-priced album. So it was kind of a format that suited the nature of the music that was being made at the time and the audience that was kind of receptive to that music. And so Chris and Doug were kind of, we had the success with Boodle. We were looking at a follow-up EP for the Clean, which was Great Sounds Great, and they brought the 4-track down to Christchurch, and we sort of had the idea of we'll do there's these Dunedin bands as well, friends of the Cleans, like this, Martin Phillips with the Chills. I heard a little bit, thought they were good, knew a little bit about the Stones, knew that I'd seen the Verlaines and really liked them, all quite different bands. And I think David Kilgour suggested the Sneaky Feelings. And we thought, well, we'll just do something that makes no economic sense, of course, and we'll do a double 12-inch EP, Dunedin Double. So over the course of about 3 weeks, we recorded the Clean EP, the Dunedin Double, I think a Mainly Spaniard 7-inch single, and Tall Dwarfs' Louis Likes His Daily Dip EP. So that was when Chris's own music, he started to release that through us. So yeah, that was kind of a time of sort of establishing the relationship and working forward for that. And those other Dunedin bands, the starts of their careers, the Chills and Verlaines, Sneaky Feelings, Stones made one more EP, but were a great band. That was sort of the start of it, really. So it was out of that relationship between all of us, between Chris and Doug and I and the bands, I guess. And there was sort of real strength to that. There was I couldn't have done that alone. I think Chris probably understood, Doug probably understood they couldn't sort of have that sort of relationship with another record company, more a conventional record company. The bands that came out of Dunedin, the bands that we recorded on the Dunedin Double, so people refer to it as the Dunedin Sound or the start of the Dunedin Sound, but they're all quite distinctly different bands. The Chills are quite different to the Stones, who are radically different to the Verlaines, who are completely different to the Sneaky Feelings. I think it was David Kilgour that coined the phrase, the Dunedin Sound, for want of anything better, of a way of describing the other bands that came from Dunedin. But I think it possibly wasn't so much I think perhaps there is a Dunedin sound, but it's a complex thing. It's a complex mix of influences. Whereas in Auckland was always obviously a bit more susceptible to overseas fashion and music, so it was a bit closer to the rest of the known world. And where perhaps there was ska happening in Britain, and there would be a ska band in Auckland, and so forth, and they dressed a bit sort of snappier too, in a kind of more international way. Whereas in South Island, fashion wasn't such a thing. It was, people were still listening to the same records they were listening to in the '60s, and there was more of a stew going on. There was more of a soupy thing of all sorts of. It wasn't just the Velvet Underground. It was, '60s music generally, and Big Star from the '70s, and with it all being given a push along by the whole punk thing, that you can do the idea that you can do this yourself and you can make music, and integrating all those different ideas into the sounds that you could make. And there were practicalities, I think, in Dunedin too. That they were playing big old wooden halls. So how do you fill that room out with sound? Lots of reverb probably helps. Masks a few mistakes, makes it a bit blurrier. Get a few drones going on, a bit of jangle. I mean, all good things. But I think they sort of set them apart from what was happening in the North Island. Even Christchurch was a different kind of dynamic going on. But I think that's sort of what sort of helps. I mean, we talk about the Dunedin sound as though it sounds like a really simple, one-dimensional thing, but it's not. It's sort of lots of different layers, which some of the bands sort of pull out certain ideas from here and there. It's a complex thing. Song structures as well, I think, clean. I mean, Tally Ho, is that really a song? Does it have a chorus, or is it all a chorus? I forget. But, so it started breaking things up and playing with song structures in a way that was quite unconventional, not just for New Zealand, but for internationally, I think. And, so all those things kind of helped create this very nebulous idea of a Dunedin sound, and which is what I think, why people sort of picked up on it internationally, why people liked it, or picked up their ears overseas and kind of twigged to something special was happening. That do-it-yourself ethic was something that came out of the whole punk thing, the whole post-punk thing, was that you could make music yourself, and you could arrange to make the records, get the records made, and glue the covers together and have them distributed. In the UK and across Europe, and there was a big market for that. And I think there was an affinity. We kind of realised for the first time that there was a connection. You could read The NME and see that the Saints were selling their first album in Britain, that the Go-Betweens were actually based in Britain, or the birthday party had been to Britain and terrible things had happened and they'd broken up or whatever. But there seemed all of a sudden, and plus all those American punk bands, an important part of their careers was going to Britain and generating press, UK music press, out of London, which then had an influence around the rest of the world. So I guess we were kind of part of that. We could see that there were connections. Writers that were interested in Australian music, for example, that sort of interesting Australian music, for example, were obvious ways in. So we were always quite conscious of that, because I think it was with punk. I mean, well before I started Flying Nun, it was obvious that there was an interconnectivity of what was being picked up around the world. I mean, it was small. There weren't all that many bands, but it become more international in an underground kind of way. After his experience with Toy Love recording an album in Australia, he didn't want to do that again. He wanted to be in control of his own destiny, making the music he wanted to make, that he also kind of knew that there was an audience for. He wanted to take the non-stream approach and connect directly without a big record company kind of acting in between. Which is when he linked up with us, or myself. And I think it sort of allowed sort of Chris a degree of freedom, that he was an illustrator, fantastic art. Made some really innovative, fantastic records as one half of the Tour de Wars with Alec. Those EPs through the 1980s are phenomenally good. And went on to make some albums, actually went back into conventional recording studios, made some really good albums, toured overseas, loved internationally, made some great solo albums as well, not given lightly. I mean, it sold a lot of bread, that song. Sort of just did lots of stuff on his own terms, really, in a kind of a key popular culture kind of guy. You know, he wasn't interested in, it wasn't high art as far as he was concerned. It was, you know, what he could produce himself without over intellectualizing it or overthinking it. And what you see and what you hear, I mean, it's, you know, you're connecting, it's Chris communicating directly to you without any of the usual sort of industry filters, I guess. So he was a pivotal sort of character in the whole sort of Flying Nun setup, really, for forever. And a lot of the Flying Nun success is, you know, due to his involvement. And yeah, key character. So the business, it grew from a small do-it-yourself kind of enterprise. You know, we started selling records overseas, started shipping finished records, started licensing records to record companies in Europe and the UK and the States. And the band started to, the Chills went over and got a big deal, and Sneaky Feelings and the Bats travelled over soon after. Fantastic press, and we were selling more and more, but it was sort of essentially the same old problems. We were based in New Zealand, miles from anywhere, totally isolated in a small, very small home market, and not really having conventional, you know, hit records, but selling solid amounts of records, but not, you know, the economics were tricky, and we were grossly undercapitalised. And of course, independent record company, what bankers, I did get some money out of the bank actually. What sensible bank would, you know, what investor would invest in an independent record company based in New Zealand? So eventually, I mean, it grew to the point where really the finances became so stressed that it was either find an international partner or just get smaller. Just for the bigger bands, just try and find them a home, perhaps with a company that could look after them internationally, which would mean signing with a multinational, I guess. But we had a bit of interest. A few companies were interested. We hooked up with Mushroom in Australia because they were from the same part of the world. Quite different musically, quite a different music culture in Australian music generally. Mushroom, they had hits by generating radio play. Music in Australia is quite sort of rock because they play, bands play every night and play for years, and there's a rock thing going on, quite different to the sort of arty music thing that we were sort of doing in New Zealand. So it was a slight clash of cultures, but I sort of felt we had the opportunity to do a deal with a multinational based out of New York, but I felt that was just too far away, that I just couldn't see how that could quite work practically. So we gave that a good crack, and Mushroom, you know, they put a lot of effort into a number of key bands we thought had a shot at building careers, you know, not necessarily, you know, becoming U2, but being able to play, you know, release records and tour and make a living out of playing music full time. That was kind of the idea for me. We gave that a good crack, and I ended up moving to London to try and help that whole thing along. I sort of learned quite a lot quite quickly, and sort of became quite disillusioned with it really. But, you know, we were sort of, I guess in Flying Nun's heyday in the 80s, it was very much, you know, hand to mouth. We were sort of, you know, winging it, might be the expression, but I think the music business by nature is, you know, it's winging it. It's people making decisions at the last possible moment on whatever resources they've got to hand, and quite often a lot of things happening out of desperation rather than, you know, any planning or, you know, any sort of established mainstream sort of business techniques being applied. Whereas previously I'd had direct control, for good or bad, I had some sort of control over whatever was going wrong. Whereas now I had no control over what was going wrong. It's quite different. Both bad for your health, I think, but I know which I prefer. Britain was a bit of an education in that it's sort of one of the centres of the music business, with just all this sort of quite diabolical behaviour going on. You go and see a band because you quite like them, and there's no actual audience there. It's just sort of A&R people from record companies waving checkbooks. It's quite a different. I wonder how many of those people were actually fans. Grunge, and to a lesser extent Britpop, dealt us a bit of a blow, and we had a number of bands that were kind of trying to do things overseas, but really, but Dunedin wasn't Seattle that year. It was all Seattle. If we'd had a Seattle band, we would have been fine. But that sort of killed it really. Nirvana were huge, and that was a massive shift that just took everything else out. For at least a couple of years afterwards. And then Britain, you had that whole their kind of response to that was Britpop, which sucked up any oxygen, any of the oxygen that was left over from Sub Pop, from the whole Sub Pop Seattle thing. So it was hard. It was hard to kind of make inroads into that, because the music was simply it simply wasn't fashionable. And it doesn't mean the music was bad. It just means that people were just looking in a different direction. We didn't have contracts because we didn't know what a contract. What would it be? What would be in it? What would we be talking about? And it was the same with recording. How do you do it? And we found out, whether it was the bands in a recording studio or we trying to work out how to make or sell records. We just did it by doing it. Found out by doing it, and making mistakes, and trying to do it better next time. And that's the way the label evolved. And for a good 10 or so years, that's the way, and that was the golden period for the music as well. And that I don't think anyone had sort of any huge expectations. There was no idea that there's this pot of money at the end of the rainbow. We didn't quite know about the rainbow at that stage, but it was everyone was making music for music's sake. And I think as a label, our idea wasn't we went in it it wasn't a business concept. I was a fan, and I wanted to help get this music out there and make it available, and somehow be able to finance the recordings to make the records and to do another one next time. That was kind of the motivating factor. And I think that again is because of that insular. We were stuck here at the bottom of the world, and there weren't any other major record companies from London or LA sniffing around, Or it would have been all quite different and quite boring quite quickly. I'm in Love with These Times, of course, is a very early Clean song, co-written by the Kilgour brothers and Peter Guttridge. And it was recorded by Nelsh Belter Space, so that's the precursor to Belter Space. So that was Alistair Parker and Hamish Kilgour, Ross Humphreys. They were in a band together, Nelsh Belter Space, and they recorded this old Clean song, I'm in Love with These Times. Which, of course, it's an ironic title, in that, written in the early 80s, and it's about Rogernomics and things not being quite right, which I enjoy the title because it's it's a cliche, but the best of times, the worst of times, with the highs that were sort of the corresponding lows of so for me the song sums up my whole experience of the 80s, and it was fantastic. It was the best years of my life, but at the same time there was a price to pay. It was also at times quite awful. And the song sort of it clanks along. It's got a nice, it's a forceful, it's moving forward, it's building, but it's stuttering and jerking, and sums it up nicely, the whole experience.